Relationships are difficult. I think we know that. And for all of us that have relationships and we interact with other people, we know that we're going to bump into each other at some point, and we're going to have some level of conflict. And if you think about it, there's really no place to pick up training on relationships. You don't really learn it a ton at home unless our families are really intentional about training us that. And we don't really learn it a ton in school, right? There's no class that teaches us how to interact with other human beings and how to do that successfully. And but really, relationships are a part of all that we do and all that we are. And so we want to begin to talk about how do we do interpersonal relationships? How do we win in relationships, and how we do it in a way that would be God-honoring? And so I want us to, as we begin our time here, look into really the reason why relationships are difficult here on the planet. You know, when we look at interacting with another human being, why do we always bump into each other, and why do things always get difficult? Whether it's in a marriage relationship or dating or parent-child or friendship or maybe a co-worker, right, or boss-employee, we're always bumping into each other at one time or another where we hit these points of conflict. Where does that come from, and why does that happen? I think if we're going to get our minds around it, we really have to go back to kind of the beginning. We look back into the book of Genesis where humanity began. We would see that in Genesis 2, things were perfect. There was ultimate harmony between Adam and Eve and between God, and everything was at peace. And then something happened that changed everything, right? Sin entered the world. Adam and Eve chose to disobey God. And then something happened in their relationship with each other and also in their relationship with God, and discord was introduced, disharmony was introduced. Their relationship had tension. They're accusing one another. They're banished from the Garden of Eden. When they have children, murder is thrown in. Everything changed. And since that point on, there has been tension and frustration and discord in relationships, really, from the beginning of history and those first human beings onto the current day. And so when sin entered the world, here's a fact and an inevitability that now shows up, that pain is part of our lives, that we're going to hurt each other, we're going to hurt kind of other people that we're in a relationship with, and maybe more importantly for our conversations is that we are going to get hurt, right? That people are going to sin against us, and then pain is going to be introduced into our lives. It's not really a question of if that's going to happen, it's a question of when. Right? So people are going to hurt me, and pain is going to be a part of my life. Why that's so significant is that pain does something to me. Right? When I'm hurt, when I'm sinned against, and my who I am is offended, I'll usually have a couple different responses. One is I'm gonna kind of fight against that person. I'm gonna push back against that pain. I'm gonna kind of choose a fight response. Or maybe I flip the other way, and when I'm hurt, I run from the pain. I choose flight. And I'm going to get away from it, and I'm going to kind of flee a relationship and view it in a disposable way. And I'm going to throw that person away. I'm going to consider them dead to me, and I'm going to run from it. And where God would actually help us to choose a third option, which is to really deal with that pain. Right? How do I look at the pain that's introduced into my life through sin, and how do I deal with it in a way that is mature and godly and responsible, and to realize that if I don't deal with that, that's really going to show up in my life. If you ever watch the difference, it's fascinating to me to watch children and interact with children. They're filled with joy and life and ambition and dreams. You talk to young people and children in general, they're loaded with that stuff. If you look at folks at the other end of the spectrum of life, in the elderly, they really break out into two camps. Think about it. If you interact with folks who have lived life and walked on the planet a long, long time, they usually fall into two different categories. One is those folks are loaded with joy. They're filled with hope. They have wisdom that they've added to their years, or they're on the other end of the spectrum. And it almost feels like life has been sucked out of them, and there's a bitterness and a loss of joy and a loss of hope. How did they lose track of that from being a child to being an elderly adult? I think it's how we manage pain is what determines if we land in kind of a joy-filled state that we've added wisdom to, or a place of bitterness and maybe a loss of that joy and a loss of hope. And so in our relationships with each other, and as we navigate life, man, we want to do this thing well. We want to take the inevitable hurts that come into our lives, and we want to recognize those for what they are. We don't want to fight against people, and we don't want to run from people. We want to deal with things as they come up. And we also want to add to another perspective to it, that this pain that shows up in our lives, we have to do something with it. Because God is doing something with it. There's something that's happening in the spiritual realm that's going on as well. And what's happening there is when pain enters my life, God has an agenda of what He can do with that pain. He actually uses that pain in our lives to mold us and shape us and change us to be more and more like Jesus. It's a fascinating, amazing agenda to know that we have a God that loves us, and even when evil comes upon us, He can bring good out of it. Now, the flip side is also true, that we have an enemy that would look at that pain in our lives and would want to maximize that pain in us to the other agenda, where that would be cause for destruction. And the enemy would want to look and say, I want to use that pain and I want to disable you with it, to cause you to not to be functional, to shut down in relationships, to not trust people anymore. And you can see over time examples, maybe even in your own life, where you have seen people who have been hurt in amazing and horrific ways and see God use that for great good. And somehow they've captured that pain, and they now are more skilled in interacting with other human beings because God has maximized that pain for good. And maybe you think of other folks in your life that have been hurt in horrific ways, and you see that maybe Satan has grabbed hold of that and they've allowed that to happen in their lives, and it's shut them down and disabled them. And there's a lack of functionality in other relationships as they interact in friendship or marriage or in parenting or in the workplace, that they've lost the ability to relate with people and to function in the way really that we're designed to function. So that's what we're going to be talking about in these following sessions, interpersonal relationships. We want to be good at interacting with each other. That's what we're designed to do. We're designed to relate both to God and to each other, and we want to do that in a way that is skilled and wise and godly. And if we're going to be honest, this is probably one of the most difficult things to do well in life. And like we said from the beginning, there's often not a lot of training on it. But we want to tackle this subject, and what we're going to do over the course of these sessions, you're going to hear from experienced pastors and counselors and teachers, and they're going to talk us through what they have learned in interacting and helping other people to win in relationships. And so we're going to be learning a ton during this time, and I would just encourage you to really lock in and to be honest, both with the pain that we have experienced and maybe you've experienced personally, and begin to look and see, how does this show up in my relationships with other people?